The British prisoners surrendered with their hands up. They had no weapons. They offered no resistance. They were soldiers from the 2nd Battalion Norfolk Regiment. They were lined up against the wall of a barn in Le Paradis. Then the men of the Totenkopf division opened fire with machine guns. They fell one by one. Some were still breathing. Then they drew their bayonets. A month later in Chasselet, they did it again. This time it was the Senegalese riflemen of the French army. They made them dig their own graves. They separated them by the color of their skin. Then they fired at point-blank range. For hours, screams could be heard among the trees. It was not combat. It was not war. It was systematic murder, cold-bloodedly executed, legitimized by ideology. This is what the men with the skull and crossbones did. The SS Totenkopf division, the Aubigny-en-Artois massacre. The fire illuminated the outlines of the stables as black smoke rose in columns that blackened the sky. The usual silence of the countryside had been replaced by screams, gunshots, and the crackling of collapsing roofs. In the bushes, a mother held her son and covered his mouth. In the street, German soldiers burst into yards, threw grenades, and shot at gates. A 17-year-old boy, Paul Davier, tried to cover his father's lifeless body in a ditch. When the SS saw him move, they hung him from a tree in front of his mother. The body was left swaying like a disfigured scarecrow as the column continued its march. Aubigny-en-Artois, a village of just 900 inhabitants northwest of Arras, was singled out by Nazi violence to send a message. Terror would not be a side effect, but a deliberate weapon. The German offensive had cut through the Ardennes like a knife, leaving the Allied forces isolated in the north. The objective was clear: reach the Channel and cut France in two. On May 20th, 1940, the panzers reached Abbeville. The next day, the SS Totenkopf, a division made up of former concentration camp guards, stormed the northern French villages with a fury that had no tactical justification or military logic, only ideology and revenge. The German vanguard that crossed Aubigny did so without significant resistance. There were hundreds of refugees in the town, Belgian, French, and even civilians from the north of the country fleeing the front, and some scattered Allied soldiers. But the SS were not looking for a confrontation. They were looking for a warning. Later accounts described how the soldiers began firing into houses, throwing explosives into granaries, and setting fire to homes without warning. Men, women, and children were forced into courtyards, lined up against walls, and searched under the pretext of searching for francs-tireurs or hidden British soldiers. Some tried to flee, others pleaded for their children. None were heard. One of the survivors, Mr. Walliam, recounted how the men in his family were forcibly taken out into the courtyard. They separated the men. In groups of 5, they began shooting them in front of their parents, wives, or children. Moline fell pleading for his children. Dali was killed without a word. Moline's son and young Bizet died in each other's arms. Larue was hit by bullets, sat up bleeding, and then finished off with a shot to the head. One was the last. He was shot below the ribs, fell, and pretended to be dead. He remained motionless among the corpses, covered in blood, until the Germans withdrew. He saw patrols pass by, was kicked, heard conversations, and survived. Around him the courtyard was littered with bodies. Houses were searched one by one. Soldiers lifted mattresses, searched cupboards, and fired if they heard a creak in the floor. A small resistance by British soldiers at the local station unleashed the final fury. The SS, learning that Allies were still fighting there, redoubled the violence. Hundreds of men, many of them civilian refugees, were forcibly removed, gathered at a farmhouse near the railway crossing, and then taken to a former quarry. The order was clear and left no room for error. Line them up, execute them, bury them. 64 men were shot with machine guns side by side. There was no trial, no resistance, no chance of escape. The victims ranged in age from 16 to 73. Among them were war amputees, a man with an artificial leg, another with an amputated arm, and an elderly man who asked to be shot in place of his grandson. They were killed anyway. The commander of the SS Totenkopf division, Theodor Eicke, was present. A symbol of the regime's terror, he had been one of the founders of the concentration camp system. His presence at the massacre eliminated any possibility of justifying the crime as an individual excess or an uncontrolled reaction. It was a decision made in cold blood under direct supervision as part of the method. It was SS doctrine, total terror to break the enemy's will and preemptively punish the civilian population. The next day, as the smoke still had not cleared and the bodies were beginning to decompose under the May sun, the SS ordered the townspeople to dig the graves. Burned bodies, charred women, young men with their hands tied, some still showing signs of struggle. In total, 92 civilians were killed, although for years it was believed that the number was 98, the number engraved on the stone of the memorial. Among the bodies buried in the quarry were children, Belgian refugees, World War I veterans and workers. Most had no connection to the resistance. They did not carry weapons. They were not combatants. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time when barbarity swept through their homes. On May 24th, as the Germans withdrew, the survivors, the few who remained, began collecting the bodies. They were buried in mass graves. For more than a year, the German authorities prohibited official exhumation. It was not until March 1941 that the recovery of the bodies was authorized. The report from the Saint-Paul-sur-Ternoise gendarmerie confirmed what many already knew. There had been no confrontation. It had been an execution. Vandelicourt and Berles-Monchel, silent massacre. The sun beat down on the wheat fields of northern France when the rumble of German engines broke the stillness. From the hill overlooking the hamlet of Vandelicourt, the villagers saw several military trucks descending toward the village. It was not the first convoy to pass through since the offensive began, but this one was different. It bore the mark of death, the black insignia of the Totenkopf division. On May 22, 1940, while the 1st Company of the SS Totenkopf IR-1 Regiment was executing dozens of civilians in Aubigny-en-Artois, a few kilometers away in the villages of Vandelicourt and Berles-Monchel, it was the turn of the men of SS Totenkopf IR-2. There was no combat, there was no resistance, there were no enemy soldiers, only peasants, women, children, and the elderly. And yet the horror unfolded. Witnesses recall that the SS arrived suddenly. As soon as the truck stopped, the soldiers jumped to the ground, weapons already on their shoulders. Without firing a shot, they began searching the houses, shouting questions in incomprehensible German, and shooting at what they called a suspect. They were looking for British soldiers, that is what they said. But they found none. Then they smashed basement windows and threw grenades into the houses where families were sheltering. Within minutes, several homes were engulfed in smoke and fire. Some were shot down in the streets outside their doors. Others died inside their homes, blown apart by shrapnel. Mothers tried to protect their children. Men, hands raised, begged without understanding. It did not matter. The SS advanced like a soulless machine. There was no warning, no trial, no arrests, just bodies. The line between military search and massacre blurred with the first shot. A woman whose son was executed on the sidewalk outside her home was the one who stopped the massacre. When the officer in charge arrived at the scene after following the column from behind, he found her screaming in front of the corpses. Testimony indicates that it was this scene that made him react. He immediately ordered a ceasefire, gathered the men, loaded them into the trucks, and left. But it was too late. In total, an estimated 45 civilians were killed between the two towns. Some victims were found inside their homes, others in the town's yards or streets, and others burned to death in cellars where explosives had detonated. There was no fighting or German losses to justify such an act, and that is the most disturbing thing. It was an unprovoked crime. What drove the IR-2 men to commit this massacre? Several factors may have contributed, though none justify what happened. One of them, cited by German historians and veterans, is the rumor about the death of 3 Luftwaffe pilots stoned to death by French civilians days earlier. Although the incident was never formally verified, the rumor circulated widely among Waffen-SS troops, fueling a sense of revenge against the civilian population. Another element was the bloody experience of the previous day at the Battle of Arras. The Totenkopf had suffered a major setback against British armour, losing dozens of men. The frustration and sense of humiliation sank deep into a unit accustomed to dominating through terror. Rumours mingled with the desire for retaliation, and the victims were the inhabitants of defenceless villages. Added to this is a still debated myth, the alleged execution of 200 SS prisoners by French or British troops stripped naked and left in a pit. While there are no concrete records confirming the existence of such a massacre and no SS unit reported so many casualties, the mere fact that the rumour circulated may have fueled the executioner's anger. On the battlefields of 1940, truth mattered less than perception. The Totenkopf division was not a conventional unit. It was not part of the Heer, the regular army, nor did it adhere to the traditional codes of warfare. It was the armed wing of the Nazi regime's most brutal ideology, formed largely by former concentration camp guards. Its commander, Theodor Eicke, had been one of the architects of the camp system and fostered a discipline based on absolute obedience and contempt for the enemy, military or civilian. In Vandelicourt and Berlis-Monchel, that doctrine was translated into bloodshed. There were no snipers, no sabotage, no threats, just villagers who became targets for being in the wrong place. The fact that the massacre was stopped by the intervention of an officer does not lessen responsibility. On the contrary, it demonstrates that the massacre could have been avoided from the outset. It was not a chaotic act of combat. It was deliberate violence carried out by men who were fully aware of what they were doing. Unlike other more well-known massacres, such as that of Oradour-sur-Glane in 1944, what happened in Vandelicourt and Berlis-Monchel was relegated to the footnotes of history. There were no grand memorials or high-profile trials. The villages returned to their rural routines, rebuilt their homes, buried their dead, and the world moved on. But silence does not erase the truth. The crime happened. The victims had names. They died without having fired a weapon, without having participated in the war, without having had a choice. Revenge after the Battle of Beuvry. The waters of the La Bassée Canal, which meander silently past the town of Bethune, witnessed not only a strategic military crossing on May 24, 1940, but also an atrocity. In the neighbouring communes of Beuvry and Hanges in northern France, units of the SS Totenkopf division executed at least 58 people in cold blood. Amid the smoke of the fighting, the explosions, and the roar of weapons, the line between military operation and war crime was blurred by the brutality. Beuvry lies just east of Bethune, a natural crossing for any force, like the Totenkopf, attempting to reach Dunkirk. Following the breakthrough in the Ardennes, the Wehrmacht was advancing full speed toward the coast in an attempt to isolate and annihilate the British Expeditionary Force. But on May 24th, Hitler issued the controversial order to halt the advance on Dunkirk, forcing many units like the Totenkopf to withdraw and reorganize just after crossing the Channel. This double crossing amid chaos and under fire cost many German soldiers their lives and unleashed a fury that was soon channeled in the wrong direction. In this context, the 3rd Battalion of the SS Totenkopf Infantry Regiment No. 1, under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Walter Bestmann, took the lead in operations at Beuvry. Fighting alongside them was the 1st Company of the SS Totenkopf Pioneer Battalion, commanded by SS Obersturmführer Siegfried Müller. The two men had a common background. They had previously served in the Totenkopfverbände, the organization that ran the concentration camps. Their experience was not that of traditional infantry officers, but rather that of men trained in repression and mass punishment. The capture of Beuvry was no walk in the park. Far from finding an abandoned or submissive town, the men of the SS Totenkopf division faced fierce resistance, deployed street by street, house by house. The narrow town centre, packed with low-rise red brick dwellings, offered an ideal environment for improvised defence. British and French soldiers, either stragglers or deployed as cover for the retreat toward Dunkirk, took advantage of every corner. They barricaded entrances, dug positions in gardens, used cellars for shelter, and lofts as observation points. Snipers took up positions on rooftops and attics, opening fire on the German advanced forces from invisible angles. The fighting was fierce. The SS columns, coming off the failed attempt to cross the La Bassée Canal for the second time after Hitler's order to halt, arrived exhausted, tense, and on edge. The sappers tried to place charges to break through, but were surprised by accurate fire from boarded-up windows. On more than one occasion, the platoon that stormed a house found not civilians inside, but enemy soldiers hidden in the darkness, and the fighting was reduced to distances of a few meters amid overturned furniture and narrow hallways. Every room captured cost blood. Every corner was a potential trap. The SS were not trained for prolonged urban combat. Their doctrine was based on terror, mass attack, and blind obedience. But at Beuvry, there was no open field or room for maneuver, only narrow alleys, makeshift barricades, and an enemy fighting desperately. Units advanced slowly, divided, covering flanks amid burning houses and destroyed vehicles. Corpses were beginning to pile up in the ditches, many of them unrecognizable from the crossfire. In the midst of this hell, the civilian population was trapped with no way out. Residents who had not left before the battle were confined to their homes, not knowing whether they would be mistaken for enemies or caught in the line of fire. Some tried to raise white handkerchiefs or makeshift flags in their windows, but the distinction between combatant and civilian became irrelevant to many German soldiers. Hardened and poisoned by the propaganda of the invisible enemy, houses began to burn, some from explosions, others deliberately set on fire. The streets filled with smoke, screams mingled with German commands. Families took refuge in cellars, covering their ears while grenades thundered overhead. Those who emerged were violently interrogated, robbed of their belongings, or shot on arbitrary suspicion. Women searched for their children in the rubble. The elderly cried for help that was not forthcoming. The horror became a daily occurrence. As the SS advanced, the hatred accumulated from their own casualties and the frustration of the previous days began to boil over. Some soldiers refused to take prisoners, others vented their fury on the walls, the furniture, the bodies. The battle degenerated into revenge. What had begun as a military operation ended as a domestic slaughter, a spontaneous extermination where the civilian population became the default target. The scenes were horrific. Soldiers dragging bodies through the ruins, neighbors gathering the charred remains of relatives with blankets, and SS platoons executing suspects without even charging them. The terror in Beuvry was not a consequence of the fighting. It was its epilogue, and for many its true purpose. When the French defensive line was broken and the SS controlled Beuvry, the real massacre began. Instead of ensuring the safety of the population as required by the laws of war, Totenkopf troops began searching homes and forcibly removing their occupants. The orders were confusing, mixing suspicion that some residents were hiding enemy soldiers with a desire to punish the people for the resistance they encountered. Soon the executions became systematic. Men and women were taken to backyards, lined up against walls, and shot. Some were killed inside their own homes. Others died while trying to flee. There is no evidence that these victims were armed or had participated in the fighting, nor are there records indicating that they were enemy combatants disguised as civilians. What we do have are mass graves, testimonies from survivors, and a confirmed number. 48 dead at Beuvry, killed by soldiers wearing the skull symbol on their caps, who had been trained not only to kill, but to do so without question. On the same day in the neighboring town of Hinges, the 3rd Company of the SS Totenkopf Pioneer Battalion, under the command of SS Obersturmführer Max Seeler, carried out another summary execution. 10 people were killed in retaliation for the death of a German soldier allegedly executed by French forces after being captured. It is unclear whether the victims at Hinges were civilians or prisoners of war. Records are imprecise, sources contradictory, but the logic is the same. Collective punishment, immediate revenge, arbitrary justice meted out by force of arms. The doctrine of terror prevailed over any military code. What happened at Beuvry and Hinges was not an accident or an isolated excess. It was part of a clear pattern of criminal conduct by the Totenkopf division during the French campaign. Days earlier at Aubigny-en-Artois, the same unit had executed more than 90 civilians. At Le Paradis on May 27th, men of SS Totenkopf IR2 massacred 97 British soldiers of the Norfolk Regiment after their surrender. At Chasselet, they murdered Senegalese soldiers of the French army in cold blood. The constant in all these cases is the same: a permissive chain of command, a racially motivated and fanatical ideology, and a culture of unrestricted obedience. The past of many of these officers in the concentration camps is not a minor detail. It is the root of the brutality later applied on the battlefield. Hell at Le Paradis, the massacre of the 2nd Norfolk. The morning of May 27th, 1940, began with the roar of artillery in the Locon-Merville region of northern France. German troops of the 3rd SS Division Totenkopf had crossed the La Bassée Canal for the second time the day before, following an order from Hitler that first forced them to retreat and now required them to resume the advance against the British retreating toward Dunkirk. Early in the day, the SS found themselves caught in brutal combat against well-entrenched British forces. In the trenches among barns and bushes, the men of the 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment had turned the area into a death trap. German casualties were catastrophic: 4 officers dead, 150 enlisted men killed, and nearly 500 more wounded. The companies were exhausted, morale at rock bottom. Among the hardest-hit units was the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion of SS Totenkopf Infantry Regiment 2, commanded by SS Obersturmführer Fritz Knöchlein. This battalion had fought from the very beginning, suffering intensely with every inch of its advance against the British positions. When the British finally began to withdraw from Lacon-Merville, the men of 1st SS Totenkopf Infantry Regiment 2 moved to the next immediate objective, the hamlet of Le Paradis. It was nothing more than a collection of farmhouses scattered among the wheat fields with dirt roads and low stone walls on the outskirts of Lestrem. There, entrenched between brick walls, orchards, and sheds, was an isolated position of the 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment. They were exhausted men, many wounded, but they were not ready to surrender. Even though the British High Command had already given the order to retreat, this detachment, nearly 100 soldiers, decided to resist. They knew they were alone. They knew no support would arrive, but they also knew that any time they held out meant hours gained for their comrades retreating toward Dunkirk. They dug in at a farmhouse on the Rue du Paradis, surrounded the main house with sandbags, converted the barn into a defensive position, established firing zones in the windows, and prepared what they knew would be their last line. The sun was setting slowly and scorchingly over the fields as the 1st SS men approached the farm. Their clothes were already spattered with blood and mud, hardened by the casualties they had suffered that morning at Locon-Merville. Upon seeing the barn, they saw what appeared to be a white flag hanging from the loft. It was a sign of surrender, and one of the German soldiers moved forward to make contact. As he approached the entrance, a sharp shot erupted from inside the barn, knocking him down instantly. 2 other men ran to assist him, but a burst of machine gun fire from a window hit them. One fell with his chest open, the other, screaming, crawled behind a pile of stones. What followed was a firestorm. The white flag had been a decoy, or perhaps a misinterpreted signal. For the Germans, it was betrayal. For the British, it was survival. The truth is that at that moment, any possibility of mercy was shattered. The 3rd Company, under the command of Fritz Knöchlein, began the assault. The brick walls of the farmhouse bounced the bullets as if they were made of steel. The British positions were well chosen, the firing ranges covered, and the soldiers fired each round accurately. But they were fewer and fewer, and the SS forces were ever more numerous. The barn was surrounded. The windows began to explode one by one. The wooden posts holding up the roof creaked with each impact. The main house began to burn when a grenade exploded in the kitchen. For more than 5 hours, the British held out. Wounded soldiers on the ground continued firing. One soldier, his guts bulging out, begged for ammunition. Another shouted his mother's name as he pulled the trigger. Smoke filled the lungs. The heat of the fire seared the skin. The ground shook with each burst. It was hell, and it had a name, Le Paradis. Finally, at 5 post-meridium, having exhausted the last box of ammunition, the men of the 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment surrendered. They emerged one by one, staggering, dirty, covered in blood and ash. Some helped the wounded walk, others leaned on empty rifles as if they were walking sticks. 99 men, no weapons, no ammunition, no way to continue fighting. They were gathered in a dirt field behind the farm. They were not given water. They were not allowed to sit down. They were lined up against a low wall. No one spoke to them. Only the sound of machine guns being mounted broke the silence. The weapons came from the 4th Company, commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Robert Schreiber. The cannons were placed on tripods perfectly aligned with the prisoners' bodies. No one objected. No one asked for confirmation. It was an execution. 99 British soldiers emerged with their hands raised. They were disarmed and lined up in the adjacent field along a wall. At that moment, under circumstances never fully clarified, machine guns from the 4th Company, commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Hans Robert Schreiber, were deployed. They opened fire. The British soldiers were killed in seconds. Some were still breathing, wounded. Then the soldiers approached with bayonets and finished off the survivors. The first shots were fired simultaneously. The bursts cut through the air like blades. Men fell in rows. Some screamed. Others did not even have time. Several died with their eyes open. A few survived the first volley. They crawled among the bodies, moaning, calling for help. Then the bayonets arrived. The SS walked among the corpses, stabbing those still breathing. One of the British was stabbed 3 times in the abdomen. Another was finished off with a shot to the mouth. 2 men survived the massacre. Privates Albert Pooley and William O'Callaghan. Severely wounded, they played dead under the bodies of their comrades. Days later, they were found by French peasants and taken to a hospital. After the occupation, they were captured by the Germans and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. His testimony was key to the post-war investigation into the crime. In 1948, Fritz Knöchlein was captured, tried in Hamburg for war crimes and sentenced to death. He was executed in 1949. During the trial, Knöchlein argued that it had been a combat action, that the British had not surrendered in accordance with the laws of war, and that they had fired under a white flag. However, the testimony of Pooley and O'Callaghan, along with forensic findings, demonstrated that it was a mass execution of unarmed prisoners. Over the years, some scholars have questioned whether Knöchlein was directly responsible. They point to SS Hauptsturmführer Schreiber as the actual perpetrator. They argue that since Schreiber was superior in the hierarchy and had the machine guns used at his disposal, he was the one who ordered the firing. However, Schreiber died in combat before the end of the war, and Knöchlein, having survived, became the target of the court. A memorial stands at the site of the massacre. The remains of the 97 British soldiers were exhumed in 1942 and buried in the Le Paradis War Cemetery. The site remains a place of remembrance and tribute. Every year, British veterans and their families attend commemorative ceremonies. The Le Paradis massacre was neither an accident nor a confusing event in the heat of battle. It was a deliberate war crime. It represents one of the clearest examples of how the Waffen-SS, trained in the doctrine of terror and absolute obedience, applied the same logic of extermination to conventional warfare situations. The case of Fritz Knöchlein, guilty or not, also symbolizes the difficulty of delivering justice when the crime is collective and the chain of command is blurred. But the facts remain. 97 men surrendered and were killed. 2 survived to tell the tale, and Europe, a continent still bleeding from the war, was beginning to learn the true face of the SS. Today, Le Paradis is a name that belies its fate. In that corner of France, hell broke loose in the form of a mass execution. And memory demands that those who died without being able to defend themselves be counted, remembered, and honored, executed for their skin color. During the 3rd week of June 1940, when France had already requested an armistice and the bells of defeat were ringing from Paris to Marseille, a massacre was taking place on the southern front. In Chasselet, north of Lyon, nearly 50 African soldiers of the 25th Senegalese Tirailleurs Regiment were murdered by German troops, mainly from the Wehrmacht's 10th Panzer Division, and according to several later testimonies and documents, with the participation of elements of the SS Totenkopf Division, the Chasselet massacre, perpetrated on June 19th and 20th, was one of the most brutal racist crimes committed during the French campaign. On June 18th, the city of Lyon was declared an open city by the French authorities, with the intention of preventing the destruction of its infrastructure and protecting its civilian population. However, Colonel Germain, commander of the 25th Senegalese Tirailleurs Regiment, decided not to heed the order. He and his men, including African soldiers from French colonies in West Africa, positioned themselves in the Chasselet sector to defend the northern entrance to Lyon. The French soldiers improvised barricades, dug trenches, set up machine gun nests, and deployed defensive positions around the village. Despite being poorly equipped, lacking armor, and with limited ammunition supplies, they tenaciously resisted the advancing German forces. On the morning of June 19th, advanced elements of the Grossdeutschland Regiment and the SS Totenkopf Division, supported by armored units of the 10th Panzer Division, approached the sector. Early in the day, a German officer moving toward Lyon, waving a white flag from an armored vehicle, was shot and killed by a sniper, sparking fury in the German ranks. The Axis forces assumed that Lyon's surrender had been a sham and responded with disproportionate violence. The fighting in Chasselet was intense. For more than 24 hours, the French soldiers, mostly Africans, resisted the German attacks. The fields surrounding the town became a crossfire zone, with houses burning, villages fleeing, and gunfire echoing through the nearby woods. Despite their bravery, the tirailleurs were overwhelmed by German technical and numerical superiority. On June 20th, having exhausted their resources, the French troops surrendered almost immediately. The prisoners were separated by their skin color. The white French officers were taken aside and sent as prisoners of war. The Senegalese tirailleurs, on the other hand, were forced to walk toward an open field at a place called Le Vide-Sac. There, according to French witness accounts and military reports, German soldiers forced white officers to lie on the ground and witness the execution of their African comrades. The tirailleurs were lined up and machine-gunned. But the horror did not end there. After the executions, the tanks of the 10th Panzer Division drove over the bodies, crushing them to ensure no survivors remained. Figures vary depending on the source, but it is estimated that between 50 and 60 African soldiers were killed after surrendering. In total, including those killed during the fighting, the number of French dead in the sector amounted to nearly 200, many of them Senegalese. Sisters at the nearby Montluzin convent reported witnessing German soldiers execute several wounded black soldiers inside the religious buildings. Other local residents described the bodies being hastily dumped in ditches and covered with earth. Despite the climate of terror imposed by the occupation authorities, the villagers of Chasselet disobeyed German orders and buried the bodies of the African soldiers with respect. They even kept dog tags, identification, and personal belongings, hoping to honor their graves in the future. After the war ended in 1942 under the Vichy government, the Tata Sénégalais de Chasselet was built, a Sudanese-style funerary mausoleum constructed by African workers to pay tribute to their murdered compatriots. The Tata, a term designating a traditional burial site in certain regions of West Africa, became a symbolic place of remembrance for both France and its former colonies. For decades, the massacre was attributed exclusively to the SS Totenkopf Division. However, subsequent investigations, including the discovery in 2021 of a series of photographs taken by German soldiers, have confirmed that the Wehrmacht's 10th Panzer Division played a direct and primary role in the killings. The involvement of Totenkopf elements appears to have been limited to isolated executions, such as the massacre of wounded prisoners at the convent. The report by SS Hauptsturmführer Adolf Kurz, commander of the 1st SKIR-1 states, 44 blacks killed, 10 white officers taken prisoner. This lapidary and inhumane statement illustrates the racist mentality that permeated not only the SS, but also much of the German High Command. Several factors converged in the Chasselet massacre. Unexpected resistance following Lyon's declaration of surrender, an ambush that killed a high-ranking officer, and a racial doctrine that dehumanized African soldiers. Unlike the white French officers who were treated as prisoners under the Geneva Conventions, the Senegalese tirailleurs were considered subhuman, a burden unworthy of life. Racism was not a secondary consequence of the conflict, it was its fuel. Even before the war, Nazi propaganda and a large part of the German officer corps viewed colonial soldiers with contempt. The war in France was the stage where this ideology became practice. In Chasselet, it manifested itself in its crudest form: racial selection, summary execution, and the physical crushing of bodies. The skull faces east Demyansk. During the winter and spring of 1942, in the frozen forests and villages of the Novgorod region of northern Russia, one of the toughest and longest-running battles of the Eastern Front was fought, the Demyansk Pocket. There, surrounded by the Red Army, more than 90,000 German troops, including the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, held out for months in extreme conditions. But amid the siege, the desperate struggle for survival led to a series of war crimes that marked the conduct of the Waffen-SS in the East. The Demyansk Pocket was formed in February 1942 when Soviet forces managed to close in on the German Second Army Corps. Within this encirclement, in addition to the Totenkopf, were the 290th Infantry Division, artillery and logistics units, and a large contingent of auxiliary troops. Isolated, exposed to temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius, with scarce rations and no possibility of ground evacuation, the German soldiers relied entirely on an airlift organized by the Luftwaffe. The 3rd SS Totenkopf Division, under the command of SS Brigade Führer Theodor Eicke, was already a unit known for its brutality. Initially formed with personnel from concentration camps, its doctrine was based on terror and fanatical obedience. In Demyansk, these characteristics were exacerbated. Soviet reports and post-war testimony indicate that the Totenkopf's crimes included summary executions, mass reprisals against civilians, and systematic looting of local villages. When villages near the encirclement were recaptured by the German counterattack, their inhabitants were systematically interrogated and often executed for suspected collaboration with Soviet partisans. In particular, in the towns of Zaluchi, Bolotnoye, and Pesky, massacres of civilians were reported. After the passage of Totenkopf units, women and the elderly were lined up and shot. Their homes were burned. In some cases, according to Soviet sources and post-war reports, the bodies were left exposed as a warning. Soviet prisoners of war captured during the fighting around the pocket were rarely treated according to international conventions. They were often executed on the spot, especially if they were found with party documents, red ribbons, or simply if they spoke Caucasian languages. In one of the best documented cases, at least 42 Soviet prisoners were forced to dig their own grave on the outskirts of the village of Krasny Bor before being executed by a unit subordinate to the 3rd Battalion of the Totenkopf. Hunger, isolation, and ideological radicalization combined in Demyansk to create a scenario of indiscriminate violence. The looting of villages was not limited to the search for food, watches. Clothing, tools, and livestock were also confiscated, and homes that were not of military use were destroyed. Soldiers who protested the treatment of civilians were punished or threatened. Several later testimonies mentioned that Totenkopf officers referred to Russian peasants as subhuman or Bolshevik scum. Theodor Eicke himself, the division's commander, encouraged this type of behavior. In his operational orders, he explicitly stated that anyone who hinders or delays the SS offensive must be eliminated without trial. Under this doctrine, even children were considered potential threats if they were suspected of passing information to the partisans. In at least 2 documented incidents, teenagers were executed for carrying written notes found in their pockets. The evacuation of the wounded also revealed brutal discrimination. Wounded Totenkopf soldiers were evacuated primarily by air. In contrast, Ukrainian auxiliaries or recruits of Slavic origin, even those seriously wounded, were abandoned in field hospitals, which were then destroyed to prevent their capture. A medical witness captured by the Soviets stated in 1946 that at least 3 truckloads of wounded were directly executed with grenades to prevent their capture. The civilian population of the Demyansk region, caught between the fronts, suffered particularly during the Totenkopf clearance operations. Soviet archives recovered in the 1960s document at least 8 entire villages partially destroyed after their occupation by the SS. Churches were converted into machine gun posts, cemeteries looted, and schools burned. Although the siege of Demyansk was partially broken in April 1942 by Operation Brückenkopf, the German presence in the region continued into early 1943. During that time, the Totenkopf established a reputation for brutality. That would follow it in subsequent campaigns, such as Kursk and Kharkov. The violence unleashed in Demyansk was neither an accident nor the act of desperate soldiers. It was the natural extension of a doctrine of racial and total war implemented by the SS High Command. The idea that the Soviet enemy did not deserve human consideration legitimized acts of barbarism that became routine. The Demyansk pocket was in this sense a laboratory for the war of extermination that Hitler would take to its climax in the following years. Today, the Demyansk region preserves some memorials and plaques commemorating the fallen, both Soviet and German. But the crimes committed by the Totenkopf in those cold, dark months are barely known outside of academic circles. Yet they form an essential part of the catalogue of atrocities that define the true nature of the Waffen-SS in the East. Not just a military force, but an instrument of racial terror. Remembering Demyansk is not just an exercise in historical memory. It is an act of justice for the forgotten victims and a reminder of what happens when power combines with the ideology of hate. The Warsaw Ghetto. In April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto rose up in a desperate act of resistance against the Nazi extermination machine. It was the largest armed Jewish rebellion of the Second World War. What followed was a brutal operation of repression carried out by select units of the SS, the police, and the German army. Among the groups involved in the massacre was the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, one of the most radical and violent formations of the Third Reich. Its involvement in the liquidation of the ghetto reflected the symbiosis between military function and racial extermination that was the essence of the Waffen-SS apparatus. The uprising began on April 19, 1943, when German units entered the ghetto to carry out its final liquidation. Surprised by the organized resistance, which included pistols, grenades, and Molotov cocktails, the Nazis resorted to the most brutal repression. SS General Jürgen Stroop was appointed head of the operation and organized a force composed of units from the SS, the Ordnungspolizei, the regular army, Ukrainian and Latvian collaborators, and Gestapo personnel. Although the majority of the force was made up of Ordnungspolizei and local SS troops, the participation of Totenkopf detachments was recorded in internal documents and later statements. The 3rd SS Totenkopf Division was undergoing a recovery and reorganization phase at the time, but some elements stationed in Warsaw were used as urban combat reinforcements. This was not a massive deployment of the entire division, but rather specialized subunits used for their experience in mopping up operations, house-to-house combat, and their absolute lack of scruples toward the civilian population. Their involvement was concentrated in areas where resistance was fiercest, such as Muranovska Street, the area of the Zob Jewish Combat Organization bunker, and the ghetto's industrial areas. The methods used by the Totenkopf followed the logic of total terror, throwing flames, setting fire to buildings with combatants still inside, throwing explosives into sewers, and instantly executing women, children, and the wounded. The objective was not only to crush military resistance, but also to erase all traces of organized Jewish life. According to testimonies collected after the war, Totenkopf soldiers participated in the systematic burning of homes, the destruction of shelters with flamethrowers, and the public execution of captured prisoners, many of them unarmed. The Jewish fighters, many of them teenagers, offered fierce resistance disproportionate to the German firepower. But the balance was broken when the Nazis adopted a tactic of total destruction. Burning every house, blowing up every building, filling the sewers with gas. The Totenkopf, hardened by campaigns such as those in France and the Eastern Front, carried out these tasks without hesitation. Stroop's reports mentioned the use of experienced units to consolidate devastated blocks and clean up buildings where sporadic gunfire could still be heard. Jürgen Stroop's final report, entitled "The Warsaw Ghetto No Longer Exists," mentions that some 56,000 people were killed, captured or deported during the operation, which lasted until mid-May. Thousands died inside collapsed shelters. Others were deported to Treblinka, where they were murdered in the gas chambers. Several hundred were summarily executed at Umschlagplatz, or in the Jewish cemetery. Of these figures, it is estimated that a significant number of the direct executions and the bloodiest reprisals were committed by Totenkopf detachments. The 3rd Totenkopf Division's participation in the ghetto repression was no exception. It was part of a chain of crimes that characterized its history since its founding. As a division formed by former concentration camp guards, it carried the DNA of extermination at its core. Its actions in Warsaw were not merely an excess of frustrated soldiers in the face of resistance. It was a manifestation of the genocidal logic of the Nazi regime, implemented by units trained to kill, punish, and erase the enemy considered racially inferior. After the war, responsibility for the repression fell primarily on Jürgen Stroop, who was tried and executed. However, crimes committed by subunits like the Totenkopf were rarely prosecuted individually. Many of its members returned to civilian life or died on the Eastern Front. The anonymity of the collective crime protected hundreds of perpetrators. Today, the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is a symbol of dignity in the face of annihilation. But it is also a warning about how military structures can be corrupted by an ideology that dehumanizes and turns obedience into an instrument of extermination. The Totenkopf, as the armed wing of racial hatred, was one of the clearest faces of this corruption. Its presence in Warsaw was brief but brutal. One more mark on the map of 20th century crimes. Remembering their participation in the ghetto repression is not just an archival detail. It is part of understanding how the machinery of the Shoah worked. It was not just gas chambers, it was also flames, rifles, rubble, and entire divisions that ceased to be soldiers and became executioners. Following the collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945, war crimes committed by the Waffen-SS became a priority for the Allies. Among the units investigated and singled out for their brutality was the 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf. This division, born out of the Nazi repression apparatus, had actively participated in massacres of prisoners, executions of civilians, and reprisals in occupied zones. However, judicial proceedings against its members were limited and in many cases incomplete. This text explores the judicial fate of Totenkopf members after the war, the trials that took place, the punishments imposed, and the fate of those who evaded justice, the dissolution of the Totenkopf, and the initial captures. In May 1945, at the end of the war in Europe, the Totenkopf was in Hungary fighting on the Eastern Front. After a chaotic retreat to Austria, many of its members attempted to surrender to American or British forces, fearing they would fall into the hands of the Red Army. It is estimated that thousands managed to surrender to the Western Allies, who in the first post-war months began processes of identification, interrogation, and classification of SS prisoners. Many ordinary soldiers were initially considered merely recruited, and after brief stays in prisoner-of-war camps were released. Others were sent to internment camps while their possible involvement in war crimes was investigated. However, the enormity of the crimes, the lack of documentation, the post-war chaos, and the destruction of archives made it difficult to identify individual perpetrators. At the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, 1945 to 1946, the Waffen-SS was declared a criminal organization, along with the Gestapo and other structures of the Nazi repressive apparatus. The verdict specified that all those who had voluntarily joined the Waffen-SS and were aware of its crimes could be tried individually. This created a legal precedent that allowed members of the Totenkopf to be tried. However, Nuremberg primarily tried senior Nazi officials, and did not include a specific trial for the 3rd SS Division. Instead, subsequent trials known as the Nuremberg subsequent trials were held, including the SS Einsatzgruppen trial and the SS Totenkopfverbände trial, which focused on crimes committed in concentration camps. One of the few individual cases to achieve notoriety was that of SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knöchlein, accused of the Le Paradis massacre, where 97 British prisoners were executed by his company in 1940. Knöchlein was captured after the war, tried by a British court in Hamburg in 1948, found guilty and executed by hanging in January 1949. Knöchlein's trial was one of the few cases in which direct witness evidence was gathered, including testimony from 2 British survivors. Although his defense claimed to have acted under the laws of war, the court found the execution of surrendered prisoners an inexcusable crime. In France, judicial authorities investigated the massacres committed by the Totenkopf in Aubigny-en-Artois, Belle-Monchel, Le Paradis, Chasselet, and other towns. However, many of the direct perpetrators of the massacres of Senegalese soldiers and French civilians were never caught. The Chasselet mass grave was exhumed and documented, and the Tata Senegalais was established as a memorial site, but no specific trial was held against those responsible. Some Totenkopf members arrested in France were questioned for these crimes, but in many cases the evidence was insufficient, or the suspects were extradited to Germany. In the Soviet Union, justice was swifter and less protective. Many members of the Totenkopf captured on the Eastern Front were tried by Soviet military tribunals, convicted of war crimes, and executed. However, these trials were often summary with little documentation available after the war. A significant case was that of SS Untersturmführer Karl Radl, captured in Ukraine in 1944 and accused of participating in reprisals against villages during anti-partisan operations. He was tried in Kiev in 1946 and executed. But many names were lost among the incomplete or destroyed archives. With the arrival of the Cold War, the interest of Western powers in trying all SS members waned. Beginning in 1949, many former Totenkopf members were released from prison camps and returned to civilian life. Some held positions in the West German civil service or worked for private companies. The denazification process was uneven. While some former SS men were excluded from certain professions, others managed to hide their past. Silence was an unwritten rule. War histories omitted crimes and extolled military sacrifice. Associations of former Waffen-SS combatants, such as Hayag, took it upon themselves to rehabilitate their image, denying or minimizing the crimes. Beginning in the 1960s with the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt and the growing interest in Holocaust remembrance, research into the SS resurfaced. Historians and journalists began documenting the crimes of units like the Totenkopf. Some former members were denounced in the media or brought to trial for complicity in murder. However, the defendants' advanced age, lack of documentation, and the time elapsed made the proceedings difficult. In most cases, the accused died before sentencing. In 2016, a Munich court reopened a case against a former member of the Totenkopf accused of participating in the massacre of civilians in Ukraine. Although the case never went to trial due to the defendant's health, the case reflected a renewed interest in achieving justice even after 70 years of delay. The trials of the Totenkopf members revealed the limits of the international judicial system in the years following the war. While some perpetrators were identified and punished, the vast majority of the soldiers and officers involved never faced trial. The criminal apparatus was so vast, so impersonal, and so bureaucratic that individual responsibility was diluted. The story of the Totenkopf, its crimes, and the judicial fate of its members is also a story of the construction of silence and oblivion. But it is also a story of the perseverance of those who, through historiography, journalism, and the justice system, fought to bring the truth to light. Today, the memory of the victims and the public acknowledgement of the crimes are forms of justice. The trials were not enough, but collective memory continues to be built. The 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf was not just a military unit. It was an extermination structure with uniform and rank directly involved in the Third Reich's system of violence. Its crimes, though often unpunished, remain a warning about what happens when hatred becomes institutionalized and when obedience becomes an excuse for killing. Remembering, investigating, and judging, even if it is late, remains a historical and moral duty.